We have a man by the name of Daniel Perry who was driving through a crowd where there were riots and he couldn't get through. He saw someone who was a BLM rioter, and the BLM rioter pointed a weapon at him. It was an AK-47, and this guy, Daniel Perry, knew he was in imminent danger and he defended himself, right? This person at the other end, he perished, and Daniel Perry was actually convicted in Austin for murder. So he's now facing life in prison. Now we look at this incident and we say, well, this guy was freely traveling. He was in his car. You have roads that were blocked by people, right? So they're infringing on your right to freely travel. The police aren't there to disrupt the crowd and to allow people to freely travel. So the police are letting these riots ensue. And then you have someone who pulls out a weapon and is aiming the weapon at you. That's imminent danger, which means your life, right? Life, liberty, property, your life is at risk. You now have the right to defend yourself against this person because you don't know what the consequential actions would be. He might pull the trigger, he might not. It might be an intimidation factor. Regardless, his weapon is pointed at you, and you now have that right and obligation to defend yourself. In this situation, we're seeing in a liberal area. Austin is a liberal area, even though it's in Texas. It's like the San Francisco of Texas. And this guy has been convicted. Now, this presents a whole bunch of chaotic situations where the police department, the local police department, not just in Austin, but in a lot of these liberal cities, are allowing anarchy to occur. So anarchy, if you go on the political spectrum, you go all the way on the right, you have anarchy. You move more to the left, you have libertarianism. Okay, so let me explain this. Anarchy is there's no government, okay? Libertarianism, there's some government, and the government is there to protect individual rights. You move left, you have conservatism. So this is libertarianism, where the government is there to protect individual rights, but you also include more laws that are constitutional to put constraints on society. There's still a bunch of wiggle room, but you're putting constraints on society so civilization and society functions properly. You go more to the left, you have moderates, more to the left, Democrat, more to the left, now you have authoritarianism. So this is fascism, which is corporations working in tandem with centralized authority. You have communism, which is the government pretty much owns equity in all the businesses. So any form of authoritarianism, that's all the way on the left. So you're going from all the way on the right, no centralized control, no centralized figure. And the more left you go, the more centralized authority you're putting in that political regime. So this is like creating an anarchist situation where a bunch of people are allowed to riot, cause havoc, infringe on people's individual rights. They have weapons, which that's not inherently an unconstitutional act, but how they're using the weapons is unconstitutional. And then you have a guy who's using his Second Amendment right to defend himself, and he is now being charged for something that he should not be charged for if you look at all the evidence. Now, this guy can take his case to the appellate court so that after you have your initial trial, you can appeal it. So we'll have to see how that turns out. But we're seeing a situation where the criminals are rewarded and private law-abiding citizens are not rewarded. In fact, they're demonized for having their own rights. And so we're seeing a lot of things like gun control, for example, where, okay, there are all these mass shootings, which there's not a ton. Of course, it's being brought up in the media because there's an agenda there. If you look at the actual statistics, the number is very low. And of course, we don't even want one life to be a collateral, but it's a reality of the world that we live in. You look at gun control, so you have tragedies, crisis. Gun control is now advocated to ameliorate these situations. Gun control only hurts the law-abiding citizens. Who are the people that are committing these acts? It's criminals. So criminals are going into places that have low-level security. So they never go into police departments. They never go to military bases. They always go to schools, places where it's a gun-free zone. There's no security, no armed security, or it's a very low level, and they commit these actions. These people, these folks, they're either following the law already, or they're not following the law, and in which case, this doesn't help if you pass more regulation. And we've seen places like Chicago or New York City where they are blatantly infringing on the Second Amendment by passing all these rules and regulation, and it's largely political to even get like a concealment license. And there's more crime there in those cities than in all the other cities in the United States. So clearly these laws aren't working. These policies are not working. What it does is it allows the criminals to run rampant, and then the elected or unelected officials don't have to do a damn thing. They don't have to, well, they should be doing this because that's their responsibility, but they don't go after crime. And it's the opposite. The reverse now, what the counter effect to this is now law-abiding citizens don't have a means or method to defend themselves against criminals. And you have the elected or unelected bureaucrats, elites, whatever. They're protected. They have armed security, or they're able to play the political game and get licenses of concealment and such and so forth. But the average American, the average citizen in these cities cannot defend him or herself. So we're seeing a conglomeration, and we need to ask ourselves, when we now have a judicial system, if we go back 100 years, at the very least 100 years, but we can go back even further, at the very least 100 years, gun ownership was normalized. This was a foundation of our United States Constitution, a foundation of us being American citizens, where we have a Bill of Rights, and in there is the right to not infringe on our right to keep and bear arms. And that was intentional by design to protect ourselves from the federal government if it ever became tyrannical, because you'll have people who will be compromised on their American values. They'll scurry to places at the tops of hierarchies that have power, or the access of power, and now they can make decisions that are politically and fiscally irresponsible, which trickles down to the nation, to the states, to the cities. And of course, you can have politicians even within those local levels. And now they can enact danger and harm, or by their actions, by the politicians, by their actions, there's collateral or unintended consequences, or maybe intended consequences, depending on how you look at it. And that affects the private citizen. Now the private citizen has that Second Amendment and the rest of the rights in the Bill of Rights to defend themselves, to have some power, to balance out, to counter the power of these local, state, and federal officials. And so when we see that culture degrade, which has been done by design, so now we don't have a culture. If you go back mid 1800s, early 1900s, there were people who would walk around armed all the time. You didn't need a license of concealment. In fact, if you go even further back, you would have kids wear their rifles on their backs, and they would just travel that way. Now, I'm not advocating for that. I'm just stating what has been culturally acceptable historically. The reason why that was culturally acceptable is because it was the foundation of America. We fast forward now, no one is carrying rifles on their backs. No one is even concealing weapons. And in fact, now if you want to conceal a weapon, you have to go get a license for it, which is an infringement of the Second Amendment, because the Second Amendment says shall not be infringed. You cannot pass any law against the Second Amendment. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So whether you're a state or you're the United States Congress, you cannot pass a law. And states have their own legislature. So even in very conservative states, even in conservative/libertarian states like Texas, you still need a license of concealment. Now, I understand there's reasonability for that, right? Like the reasonability is there are tragedies, there are crises, there are crazy people, there are people with mental issues, there are criminals. So of course we would not want to have these people get access to arms because they can now hurt other people or intimidate other people, infringe on their rights in some way. Okay, that's a fair and reasonable statement. However, when you do that, you are allowing more exploitation by the federal, state, and local governments, mainly the federal government, to go after that right. That's the whole reason why it's an absolute right. I talked about this before, but we have absolute rights, we have reasonable laws. Reasonable laws have to fit within the parameter of the Constitution. Absolute rights, they're already in the Constitution. The Bill of Rights is part of the Constitution. They're we have the original amendments, but we also have new amendments. These are the rights that cannot be infringed on at all. They're absolute. No law can go against them. They're designed that way for a reason, so that the individual, like if you're an individual, right, you're just a regular 9-to-5, you make $50K a year, whatever it is, you don't really have much power against your local police department, let alone the federal government. You don't have much power. The power that you have has been distributed by the Constitution to you, right? So the Constitution gives powers, broad powers in general, but there's specific powers and duties for the federal government, specific powers and responsibilities to the states and to the local government, and then to you as a private citizen. Why is it designed that way? So that you have some way of defending yourself. You have some power to go against governments when the time comes, when you need to use it in whatever situation. Now, the average person may think, well, here's a common statement that people will make when attention is brought to them that companies are looking into their data, looking into their information. The average person might say, well, I have nothing to hide, so it doesn't matter. Let me actually preface this. Let's say the government is directly or indirectly looking into your data. So either they're directly doing it through intelligence, or they're indirectly doing it using a corporation as a proxy, like with the Twitter files. Regardless, that's a breach of the Fourth Amendment, unconstitutional. It's considered treason because you're betraying someone's individual rights. You're betraying what's on the Constitution as an absolute right. You're violating someone's civil liberties. So people will say, well, I have nothing to hide. Now, it's not about if you have something or if you don't have something to hide. That's not what the issue is. By the way, a lot of what people are hiding right now is technically constitutional, but they have to hide it because it's breaking the, let's say, state law. Okay, maybe not even federal, because different states have different laws. Let me paint an example. Again, I'm not advocating for this, but let's say in Colorado, cannabis is legal. In Texas, cannabis is illegal. And there's variations of that. So in Texas, if you have to hide that, but in Colorado it's legal, federally, constitutionally, it is lawful. It's lawful under the Constitution. Now, it's illegal at a federal level because the federal government has decided to schedule the substance as it's the highest level, so level 1, whatever the top tier schedule is. So it's in the same classes like heroin, cocaine, all that. The federal government is saying there's no medicinal or recreational use. There's no benefit there. And so even if it's legal in your state like Colorado, it's illegal at a federal level, even though it's constitutionally lawful. So I know that's kind of confusing because the Constitution, like, for example, the United States Congress had to pass an amendment to create prohibition to stop the sale, distribution, and use of alcohol. It didn't work, so they had to repeal the amendment. But they had to pass an amendment in the Constitution to say alcohol was unconstitutional. For all the other substances, they didn't pass an amendment. They just declared it, and then they put it on a schedule, and they posted it on the website, and they created the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and they said these are the narcotics that we're going after, and people just follow authority, right? People don't understand how it's all constitutional. Now, I understand there are negative repercussions for that, and that's a whole separate conversation, but I'm just using the Constitution as a basis. So if you have nothing to hide, they can make it so that you can be exploited so that whatever is legal or constitutional or illegal today, like, it can always switch. So whatever is legal today can be illegal tomorrow. Or you may think something is legal, you may think something is constitutional, but let's use legal because that's actually what they enforce on the books. They don't really care about the Constitution. I'm talking about law enforcement. If you think you have nothing to hide, they will find something if they want to politically prosecute you. If you say something that, you're criticizing the federal government, and the federal government sees you as a threat, or you're saying something that goes against a narrative, a health narrative, you will be targeted and you will be exploited. That's why you have absolute rights to protect yourself from being exploited. For a lot of people, that may seem far-fetched. You might be a dentist, you have your own practice, you have 2 kids, you're not really doing anything criminal, so you think. But we have to understand that people at the top, whether it's state, local, or federal, they always want power. They always want control over the population. So they will find ways to enact their ideology. Their ideology is not always reasonable. So we on average, the average person, has a misconception of thinking, well, things have to take a logical step. There has to be a logical basis to get from A to B and then to B to C. When you're in a position of power and you have law enforcement at your disposal and you have the courts at your disposal and you're going against an individual or a group and they have essentially zero power. The only power you have is through individual rights, and those have to be maintained culturally for you to even have power. So if you're in that position, from whether you're an elected or unelected official, you don't really care if there's reasonability there. You just care about your ideology. And so if you need to exploit something or someone, and you can find a situation where you can exploit that, that's what you'll do. I know that's hard for a lot of people to understand, but evil is out there. Malice is out there. Even if you don't think it exists, even if you don't see it in front of your eyes, if you've read anything in history, fiction, there's a reason why evil exists, because evil is out there in human nature. Now, not all the time is it malicious evil, intentional evil for the sake of evil. A lot of times it's people are serving their own self-interest, and their self-interests happen to have people who are collateral. And that collateral is considered evil because you're infringing on people's individual rights. And if you're doing that, whether it's unintentional or intentional, even to a degree, if it's unintentional, it's still intentional. We can make a case and say, well, someone could be completely ignorant, and I would find it hard actually if someone were completely ignorant to do all this harm, because that would require some intention. You can be ignorant and still do a lot of harm, but to have an entire strategy and create an entire structure to go after people, like to politically prosecute people, that does require malice, intentional malice. So these people are out there. They've been out there in history. We've all read history. We've all learned about history, even if it's just the big names. You know that malicious people have existed in the past. You may not see it right in front of your eyes, or maybe you do, because maybe the mainstream media is telling you, hey, Putin is bad. Okay, so at least you acknowledge there are bad people out there. There are bad actors out there. Let's not be so naive to think that it's not also happening right in front of our eyes domestically. And for sure, evil will exist far into the future. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that people have their rights to defend themselves. I know the story has gone on a huge tangent, but this is simply a guy who is defending himself. He can't even protect his own life. And when he does protect his own life, he is now in this absurd court that is so biased. He's not getting a fair trial. And now he has to go through an appellate court, right? So imagine you're in that situation where your life is threatened. The only option is to protect your life. Maybe you have a family to feed. Maybe you're trying to protect someone else, protect someone in your family, protect your daughter, your son. You have to be able to use your individual rights, your absolute rights, your power in that regard, to make sure that someone else who is trying to take your individual rights is not able to go past that boundary. And that's a very difficult decision to make when you're in that situation, because you have to make a determination, and it has to be a very clear determination when you're in a emotional fight or flight response situation. Am I going to commit this action, right? That's a very difficult thing to do. That's not an easy task for anyone to take on. But it just goes to show that we're in a situation where it's not innocent until proven guilty. You don't have absolute rights. You can't defend yourself. Criminals are able to prevail. They're given no cash bails. They're out on the street even after they commit violent crimes. And the average citizen is being squeezed into a little box. Now I'm thinking more macro, but squeezed into a box, metaphorically speaking, but also physically. Like over time, they want you to be in a smaller place, less restriction or more restriction of movement, so you can't move as much. You only have access to so many resources. Like there's a whole agenda here, but point blank period is we need to preserve our individual rights. This has to be a cultural thing because culture determines largely political policy. So whatever the population wants, even if it's a minority of the population, it might only be 30-40%. That's still a huge chunk of the population. But if 30% of the population culturally speaks out about how we should have our individual rights, our right to defend ourselves, our right to protect ourselves, and we hold elected and unelected officials accountable, and we even hold other institutions like corporations accountable, or places of education, higher learning. We hold these places accountable in a reasonable and peaceful way. They will change their tune because they will have to succumb to the population, because the population is their market. So obviously the government could just tax the people a ton. They could print more money. They could use that money to subsidize these institutions. That's also a problem. But we can target those people who are committing those actions, which is effectively fraud. Like if you're just printing a bunch of this money to subsidize institutions to pass your ideological agenda, that is fraud. But if we hold all these little people who are linchpins in the structure accountable, this becomes much harder for them to try to change the system. And we now culturally take back what is deemed righteous, our right to defend ourselves.